What is it that makes the internet so dangerous? Who are the different entities, the actors, governments, people, whatever? What is it that makes the internet such a crazy, strange, kind of bad place to be? Well, we're going to get into that today. This is our sixth installation of the Lit Media Workshop. We're going to be talking about the internet. We're going to be talking about its dangers. So stay tuned. The five dangers of the internet, this framing that I'm going to be using, is based on several different actors. Five, actually. The first one is the individual. That's people like you and me. Then the next one is fandoms and groups. These are things like the K-pop stans. These are things like people who really like Mr. Beast. This is any kind of group that can organize themselves as part of something, whether it be political or social or whatever. Then I'm going to have one called publishers. That's people trying to create content. This is kind of one level up above the influencer. We have crime syndicates. You know, like mob bosses. These are the people who make the bad things on the internet, like viruses and extortions. Then we have state actors. And then really something that includes all of these things at the same time. We're going to call that social media. We went over social media in the last kind of lecture YouTube video, so I'm not going to be diving into that super great. We'll just spend a few minutes on these. We'll also discuss them in class. So, what is it that makes the individual so dangerous? Well, the individual is very difficult to predict, and they kind of have a set of rules that they should be following. But those rules are different on the internet, it seems, than in real life. How is it that we should try to avoid some of the things that are bad that happen on the internet? Well, one of them is just to realize that when it's on the internet, once on the internet, it's there forever. That's one of the rules of the internet. And because of that, it should make you take some pause. My own personal advice here is not to overinvest your emotions. So, what emotional price is needed, right? If you are looking at something on the internet, it's kind of easy to invest your time, invest your emotions when it's something that's not actually worth it. Things that probably are worth it are things like, your friends in real life, your family, your religion, things like that. What's not worth it? Probably things like people you've never met. Are not necessarily worth spending time on. So there's a whole bunch of different areas here, right? One of them is privacy. And on the internet, you can be anonymous. That means there's no actual identity included there, and maybe nobody knows it was you. You can be pseudonymous, right? And in that case, it's like you can use a pen name. Did you know that Benjamin Franklin used a pen name when he had his own newspaper? And so it was actually Benjamin Franklin, but basically he was able to imitate someone else. You might see these things mentioned as like a handle, right? Sometimes it's something like a princess. 9581, or like this is like in a game, or you might have something like Halo King 85, 92, whatever. The other advice here is that you should assume that someone is looking. Why should you assume that? Well, I'm glad you asked. You should assume that because it's probably true. There's all kinds of people who might be looking at your internet activity. This could be your parents. This could be your work. It's probably the individual companies, places like Facebook and Meta and whatever. They all have a visual on, what's actually happening here. So this is something that you should be thinking about. So what else? What else are we going to talk about now? The next danger. So I think I would summarize here and say something like, yeah, let's look at the next danger. The next danger, we've gone through individual. The next danger is groups. And it's kind of interesting, right? You have an individual, which is one person, and then you have a group or a fandom, which can be lots of different people at the same time. And there's something funny that happens. Sometimes an individual will make a dumb decision all by themselves, but kind of more often, I find people who are as in a bigger group, they might make an even bigger faux pas. So, what are some of the things that a fandom might have that a regular individual person would not have? Again, fandoms here can be lots of different things. They might represent something from like K-pop, some kind of a musical band, something from gamers, maybe something like Minecraft, or like on Reddit, for example, they have an r slash dex, and people who build decks, physical decks, they get very, very invested in the proper ways to do that. Some of this is probably valid, and some of it probably isn't. And so there's this kind of good bad thing that happens with fandoms and groups. And it's really because people have this kind of identity associated with this group, that they can do some really good things together, right? Some of the good things would be like you have a common goal, things that you're working on together. You might be learning something in particular. You might be learning something like the kinds of music that you enjoy, the kinds of game tips that you want, or how to actually build a deck. These are all like really valuable in the real world kinds of things. It might also gain some resources including actual money, or even some co-creation of things, right? You might create something like a guide. You might define some kind of a new genre. There's all kinds of good things that can come from the very, very strong identity that comes in groups that meet and meet and meet again and again. And it becomes something that's kind of bigger than itself, bigger than the sum of the parts. You might remember this kind of discussion that we had about Herbert Simon, and how things like ants, they can have individual tiny assignments, individual things that they do that end up being good for the whole ant pile, I guess. So another example that you see this emergent behavior instead of just ant piles are in things like flocks of birds. Birds that seem to move together, and they kind of break some of the wind in front of them so the people behind them can have an easier travel. They take turns. It's very, very pro-social, very, very good stuff. But there is some bad stuff too. It can also create something where people dogpile on each other. There's sort of an us versus them mentality. where it's like it's my pop guy instead of your pop guy. It's my favorite kind of thing in the game versus your kind of thing in the game. And if you take that too far, which often happens, especially in politics, it's not great. It's not great. It can also lead to targeted bullying, and where people think that as soon as you're not in the group, that because of that somehow you're a bad person. But how do you know if somebody's in the group? There's a few terms that you might be familiar with. You might have heard of virtue signaling before. And basically what that means is it's some way that you can say, I only believe in my particular kind of K-pop, group. And so I'll say, I really like mac and cheese because they really like mac and cheese. And to most people, that doesn't mean anything. Well, of course, you like mac and cheese because that is just an excellent kind of food to eat. And but within the kind of the group, there's a kind of in-group understanding. There's a kind of in-group language where it's understood as you actually know the thing. So like the big one right now, I think is 6-7. If you're not as old as me, this is kind of cool, and if you're as old as me, it's kind of cringe. And so how you see that is a tell for which kind of group you belong in. Are you young and hip? Are you old and not hip? So that is what I really just the takeaway here is that once you get lots and lots of people together, this thing that you think you're a part of becomes something else entirely. Because sometimes people will come in and out of this group, sometimes people will add to the group, and sometimes you might have a couple of different groups merge at the same time, bringing some of the values that you like, and maybe they're kind of a rough crowd. Maybe they're actually not the kinds of people that you would want in your coalition, your big mega group. The next danger of the internet comes from publishers. Publishers are things like newspapers, things like the New York Times, and content creators. So let's think in your head about something that you've read and who could have written that. Well, in order to have written that thing, probably they had to get paid to write that thing. Nowadays, if you spend a lot of time on the internet, this can be things like a blog, things like a news site, from very small operations to very large operations. Let's get a few on the paper here. So up here, I've listed things like news sites. This would be things like the New York Times, Washington Post. There's some foreign ones you probably haven't heard of, like Der Spiegel is the big German one. And these sites have traditionally created things like newspapers, which you probably have seen that before. It might have a picture, it might have some articles. It tells you about things that it says are like good or important. Usually it's bad news. There's a lot of bad news that gets printed. We also have a podcast. These are people who publish audio things that people listen to for a long time. Sometimes they'll have interviews. They could publish this on YouTube and Spotify or Apple, all kinds of different places they could publish it at. We also have influencers. Influencers are people like Jake Paul or his brother, who I don't remember the name of right now. And they basically are like individuals that are actually bigger things, right? So one of these would be like Mr. Beast, who at this point is really more of a publisher at this point. We also have information mills. These are kind of low quality, pretend-ish news sites. Some people might argue a place like Breitbart would be an information mill, or the Daily Wire. There's somewhere between a news site and an information mill. But you also have very bespoke information mills based on things like financial reporting, and the goal is to essentially just create content to get some clicks. So what are the good bad things that happen here? Good things are, you can get some information from the news. You might wonder about things that are coming up, things that are happening now in your town, someplace local. They also can provide a summary. The summary can make it where you don't actually have to do all of the calling to figure out whether some local sports thing that's happening is happening today or tomorrow or whatever. It's reading. Reading is good, right? The more you read, the more you know and understand. Maybe. And then I think it's really interesting as a historical record. You can add to history by making sure that somebody talked to somebody who knew a thing. And especially in retrospect, when you have people who eventually die, it's nice that you can go back and read some of the interviews that they had and discover what the issue is. So the bad things that can happen is your news can be totally fake. You can just make something up on the internet and publish it on a blog, and maybe somebody else will repeat it and it becomes kind of the truth or something you can't tell whether it's the truth or not. There's also publishers who push clickbait. Maybe you know that term already, but clickbait is something like you'll never believe what kind of sport they're playing in your local town tomorrow. It's something that doesn't actually give you information in the title and maybe technically somewhere explains it, and it just wants to get that mouse to click on it so they can get advertising money. Similar is rage bait. Oftentimes, a place like BuzzFeed, they will publish something that is, say, the top ten Beatles songs, right? Or top 10 artists, and then they won't include somebody like the Beatles, and it'll make people angry. But when it makes people angry, it makes them share that, it makes them retweet it, and it makes them include that information, and so they're happy. It's not actually just being correct, typically, at least in the short term, that gives these publishers money. It's how many clicks they get. It's how many people keep coming back to it. Whether they love it or hate it, it might still be an obsession. And there's also sometimes there's pay for play, where the newspapers, maybe they get bought out by a big company or some outside interest, which says, hey, it'd be really great if you wrote more about how amazing this video game is or this musical artist is or whatever, and then I'll advertise. I'll give you lots of advertising money. And if you're really interested in stuff like that, you can read Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent. This is probably not something you're going to invest your time in, but it's the information is out there. So who is it that's actually one of the people who might do that payola, who might call some kind of publisher to push something or be kind of illegitimate in that way? Could be the state actors, could be one of the crime syndicates. The next two of our 5 internet dangers or dangerous actors is crime syndicates. Now, a crime syndicate can be just about, it's kind of just like a group that we talked about before with an explicit determination, an explicit founding of the group, basically to get a bag of cash. So you could imagine them as a bunch of different people, which I'm representing here as stick figures. And their goal is to end up with a big cartoonish bag of cash, right? They want to get that money. And maybe you've been called by someone or answered the phone and you hear it and they say, hey, we have this issue here where you're in big trouble because of something in the police, and they're just making stuff up. They might want your Bitcoin. I've gotten calls. I don't have any Bitcoin really, unfortunately. They might want your cryptocurrency, and I can't think of anything really good here in terms of like a good bad comparison, but I'll list some of the common things that one of these crime syndicates would want. So, for example, a crime syndicate might try to guess your password. So, if you have a password that is like Hunter2, it's probably not a good enough password. More recently, in the last 10 years or so, many of the internet websites make you use a very strong password with the hope that it will be less easy for somebody who wants a money bag to go and get that. The other thing they have are viruses. A virus is something like freegame.exe. And if you were to download that game on your computer at home, you would get it. And then it would try to do things like email that game to all of your friends. and hope that they click on that link as well. A computer virus works a lot like a regular virus, and then it tries to infect a system. The original viruses that were around in the 80s, they traveled through SneakerNet. And so you trade a floppy disk and you stick it in one computer and it'd be like, oh, why isn't this working? You stick it in another computer, you say, oh, why isn't this disk working anymore? And what was actually happening is that it was a copied malicious file, a malicious program that copied itself and put it place other places. A relatively new one here is called ransomware. This is a lot like a virus, except it says, hey, if you give us money, we will unlock all of your files. And so there's a whole cryptocurrency thing, which I'm not going to get into in this series. But basically, if you send somebody, let's say they're in Russia, which does not have an extradition treaty with the United States, then they can unlock your files. And this has hit a lot of different places. And these locks are based off of very, very strong encryption and difficult to get rid of. There's also a bunch of different scams. One common scam is, hey, I just sent you money and it was an accident. So let's say that you see $500 is now in your bank account and they say, hey, give me that $500 back. And then what they do is they accept your $500 and then they just cancel the transaction where they were sending you $500. So they end up with an extra $500. There's also scams where maybe you're trying to buy something. Let's say it's on eBay and an individual says, hey, I will sell you this totally working Game Boy, but they ship it to you and it's totally broken. You say, oh, I can't believe this is broken. And then you forget to send it back and you're out however much money there is. Another kind of unique internet thing, which is part of social engineering, is called phishing. And in phishing, and let's even say spear phishing, which is like it, they'll send someone an email pretending to be somebody else, and they'll include a funny link. So instead of going to google.com, it'll go to like Google with an extra O. And you'll get a website that looks exactly the same as the Google website. But when you enter in your username and your password, well, then they've got it. And they might get access to other things like your bank accounts and all of that. So it's really important to be careful on the internet and to look for things like, where is this link taking me? Does it make sense that somebody has actually that I'm seeing this information, or does this smell wrong? Does this feel wrong? It's a tough skill to get, but it's worth pursuing. Our next internet danger after crime syndicates is state actors. What is a state actor? Well, let's get into that. Well, a state actor is something like a country or a city or a state that has some kind of an influence on the internet. They are acting. They are state actors. I don't really know why exactly they're called that. And you may have seen something like a TV show, movie 007, right? This was based off of kind of a real character. So there are certain organizations that collect lots and lots of information from the internet. We know a lot of this based on a person called Edward Snowden. And Edward Snowden, sometime around 2010, revealed that there was a massive data collection operation performed by a certain government, our government, the US government. And this was basically connected to lots of different countries in the world. These countries are called Five Eyes for some reason. And they were part of the NSA. And basically what it meant is that, do you remember anything about how the internet works, right? Data collection packets. And, these packets were basically being intercepted everywhere. So we have what's called the backbone of the internet, which are basically something like maybe 20 different areas where if you're traveling a message from the USA to some other country, the government basically just collects that up. And so they have deals with the different companies like Apple, IBM, Microsoft. These are all written about. You could probably find news stories about it, but I would just think it's safe to assume if the government wants some kind of information from the internet, they can get it. And not just our government, right? We also have Russia. We have places like France and Germany. They all have really effective spy networks. So one thing that you can do as a state actor that's not so great is you can collect information, lots and lots of information. The other thing that you can do is you can influence, right? So a government can pay influencers, or they can create infrastructures in their intelligence communities where they can do things like they can have sock puppets. They can do lots of bad things. And places in the Middle East, places in Africa, Europe, United States, basically everywhere in the world, I have a feeling that everybody is kind of doing this. And it's just kind of how we live, right? So that's where at least some of the fake social media comes from. So you might just create a fake account that pretends to be an American, but actually you live in Russia. And actually, if you live in Russia, you might also create a lot of sock puppets. So you might have one computer and one person orchestrating, 1,000 different fake profiles on websites. And just 1,000 profiles can really move things. And so they have a kind of a spy versus spy thing where we have like bot detectors, or we have things like um, just ways of knowing who seems authentic and who doesn't seem authentic. Why would you want this? Well, you could push some kind of agenda. You could have a politician in there that's more favorable to your trade deal. You could do something like try to get someone elected who you'd rather have there because you think that you can kind of predict the future. Or you might just want to create unrest. You might just want to say, hey, look, I want to be friends. And if we're not friends, then we're going to have a problem here, and you'll see it on the internet. And this kind of brings us back to the synthesis of all of the things that we have. We have lots of different things all connected in the world here. They're all connected. They're all living in the same area. The individuals, the fandoms, the publishers, the crime syndicates, the state actors. They're all trying to get a little piece of the pie. They're all trying to get a little bit of the eyeballs. And then all of these are kind of combined in this social media presence. And I talked about it extensively last time, where we have an algorithm in most of the social media that we consume, which is basically what the internet is. So my parting thoughts as part of this is there are so many dangers on the internet, and it's so much better to just think about something like uh, what is actually true, right? There's a few things here, right? So what is true? And can you know what's true on the internet? You can sometimes, but if you're looking at an individual piece of information, it can be difficult. And not only what is true, but what is good. What is good for me? What is good for society? Is arguing on the internet a positive thing to do right now? Am I going to change someone's mind, or could I be talking to a bot? Or could I be talking to someone who has enough time to argue on the internet? It's something you should be asking yourself. So these two questions are super important to our next topic. We are done with the internet, and we are going to be talking soon about chatbots. And the fancy word for chatbots are LLMs. It's a fun M. And the key thing is that LLMs use all of this data from social media, individuals, fandoms, publishers, crime syndicates, state actors. It all kind of bottles it up into something that can kind of repeat it. Okay, that's it. We will be discussing these two questions. What is good? What is true? So I want you to come in with questions there. Again, your homework for this week is try to compare Googling something and using an LLM for the same kind of task. And I will see you in class.